Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 104th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'd like to talk about non duality in practice, give you some practical thought experiments and exercises for your mind to sort of wrap your head around non duality in for daily life, sort of, and not in an abstract way. But first, I wanted to quickly go back to the video I did, the 103rd video I did on galactic consciousness, and just say that basically, when we look at things like solar systems or galaxies, um, what we see, what we perceive of a galaxy is similar to what a, a chimp um, would see when he looks at a quantum computer. So the chimp, because he has no idea what he's looking at, will only perceive the physical aspect of the quantum computer. It will just, see it as a bunch of colors and texture like metal and materials. But he has no idea that there is an entire universe that might live inside of that quantum computer. And so, by the same token, when we look at a galaxy from our human vantage point, what does this keep? Then what we perceive from that galaxy is exactly the same thing. Like we see it as just a material, a bunch of stars and planets that are just physical in nature, that contain just atoms and molecules that are quote unquote dead, not alive, unintelligent, and that these galaxies basically are non-conscious, and that they respond blindly to the laws of physics and obey the laws of physics, and that everything about them can be predictable. But the same can be said about a chimp looking at a quantum computer. He could say, well, if I pick up that computer and throw it, it'll disintegrate and into various parts the same way anything else in my reality it disintegrates. If I take a piece of wood and I hit it, then it will have a dent in it like this. And so, from the chimp's perspective, it wouldn't see the difference between a quantum computer and a rock or whatever. It's just that the quantum computer would be a little bit more strange, quote unquote, a little bit more complex or a little bit more unusual than what is in his immediate reality. And that was the same for us, actually, because galaxies, we had even no idea what they were until we started gazing at the sky and with telescopes, because you could only see the stars. Basically, we didn't even know that some of the things that were shining out there were galaxies. Even the concept of galaxy eluded us for quite some time. And so that's something that's really important, is this, again, this distinction between form and what's behind the form. It all depends on your level of consciousness. So when we evolve and we look at these things, they might take a totally different sort of aspect. Now on with non-duality exercises. So non-duality. The idea here is to look at a simple event or something from different vantage points. For instance, you hit your finger with a hammer. Okay, so you're working and you take a hammer and you hit your finger. Now your finger's bleeding, the nail has to come off and all that's really bloody and terrible. So let's look at this incident, this event, from the perspective of atoms. From the perspective of atoms, there's no catastrophe, nothing is problematic. There's just a bunch of atoms here that update their energetic information. So, like, depending on what happened, now some of the atoms have to, the electrons move on to another orbit or whatever, but there isn't any problem here. no atoms were smashed or broken when your hammer hit your nail or your finger. No biggie. Now, if you look at from the perspective of your cells, this is like mass catastrophe, similar to tsunami hitting the coast of Costa Rica, or a natural disaster like a forest fire, or so with mass death also, like an earthquake, a volcano eruption. So millions and millions and millions of individual cells die. um, and yeah, it's quite problematic from the human perspective. It hurts, um, but you'll get over it, of course, and you know what to do. And from the human perspective, there's also now here it's like, um, how should I say, like unforeseen disaster. And so your individual cells can say, okay, what are we going to put in place for this not to happen again? Your cells can't do that. They experience this as an unforeseen disaster. All they can do is just, because they work in a very harmonious fashion, all they can do is just heal, do their best to heal, and to help, that traumatized finger, the cells from that traumatized finger. That's all they can do. From the human perspective, I mean, it's almost as if the human perceives the suffering from all of those deaths here, and that allows the human to learn as the consciousness that is in command over your body and the hammer and the other hand and all that stuff. And you also have a sort of a human perspective on this, like, a morality to the story, like be more careful. And of course, then there is the perspective which is, how should I say, multidimensional. So that would be from the perspective of beings that will look at a human from a perspective where they can even see your future, they can see your past, they can see beyond linear time and space, and also beyond treating humans like an individual. And let's say this happened when you were 6. You were playing with your father's tools and you weren't very careful and you hit your finger. The multidimensional being will see that that event that happened, let's say that this is your moment of the now at 6 years old, and you have some roots that grow into the past, whatever your memories are at 6 years old, and then you have branches that go into the future with plenty of multiple timelines. And there is one of these timelines right here where this event didn't happen, actually. You didn't hit your finger with a hammer, and was the branch that could have happened at that point. And here you lose a hand at, let's say, 25 in by using a table saw, for instance, in a way that is not where you're not cautious enough. So you lose a hand, 25 years old. They can see that. And so what they do is that they make sure that you hit your finger with a hammer at age 6, which is only a minor sort of incident, which you'll recover from. And that incident, because it now happened, will steer you clear of that timeline, because here you still didn't learn the lesson of be careful around tools because they can hurt, and you were acting a little bit carelessly. And So that's how multidimensionality works, is that since you have a view which is beyond linear time, you can continuously adjust at every now moment. You can adjust what is happening in order to change the future and the past simultaneously from every now moment for achieving a sort of a goal or an objective that is beyond human understanding and comprehension. Now, here I gave you something that is understandable, like, for instance, the fact that you won't lose a hand at 25. But there are things that are much less understandable from our human perspective. For instance, the fact that at that incident when you were 25 and you lose a hand, you also affect a whole bunch of other humans that were working alongside of you. And then there's some work that's going to get delayed. And then that will have another chain of consequences stemming from that event that causes a whole bunch of multidimensional problems that would completely, how should I say, submerge or your human brain, because it would just be too much, too many sort of interdependent chain of events that would be triggered by this event. And so multidimensionality is not just about your life; it's about the interdependence and the the relationship between your life and the lives of 9 billion other humans, plus the whole galaxy, plus everything. And so that's why you have, and you, of course, multidimensionality, I put this as one level, but there are actually plenty of different levels within multidimensionality where things become more and more and more and more and more and more complex. And you have consciousnesses that are geared um, towards resolving these kind of overarching issues, and that gets translated as they go downwards into something like hitting your finger with a hammer. But that event has immense implications, infinite amounts of implications, down to the subatomic and also up towards the infinite, infinitely big. Now, this exercise of non-duality is quite simple, and it's not problematic for humans to think about it, because there's no right or wrong, no evil and good and what that. So you have less resistance towards acknowledging that these different levels or perceptions of the same event are exist. But the whole debate is which one is relevant for us as humans. And that's where we have to be really careful, is that it's not because this level of understanding is just as valid as this one that when you hit your fingers with a hammer, you should say, no biggie. I mean, my atoms just updated their information. And even if it hurts, I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, atoms be atoms. Um, it might also not be really relevant to look at the multidimensionality because you're going to be completely overwhelmed. So it's also really important to stay at the human level and just see what might be useful as information to sort of supplement that point of view, but not sort of give it away and try to take refuge in a level which is so you shield yourself from all the problems and all. Then you're kind of trying to escape the human perspective. That's not the point. The point is here to put a bit, to make sure that your opinion, to understand that it is relative, that is really important. So that it's not the only way of perceiving that event, and to use these other points of view as a way to inform and enrich the human perspective without trying to flee from it. So, for instance, if you're really traumatized about this event and you're now developing a phobia of hammers and stuff, maybe it's useful to look at the atomic perspective and say, okay, look, no big deal. I mean, it's not like it's the end of the world, blah, blah, blah. If you are, if you're disappointed or hate your body now because you feel like you can't control your movements, and that's why like your hands don't obey your will, and you hurt yourself with that hammer, then it might be good to look at the cell's perspective and understand just how magical the whole process of healing and everything that your cells are doing for you is really important, and how much they suffer, so that you can learn from that suffering in order to be a better human, a better um, sort of boss in command of that global organism that is a collection of cells. So all of these might be interesting, but always make sure that you stay within the human. Now, this one is going to be much more problematic. Hitler. So let's look at the atomic perspective. When you have Hitler, Nazi Germany, and millions of people dead, from the atomic perspective, again, no problem. I mean, the information contained in the bodies of all the victims just from the atomic perspective just got updated, and I mean, it's not like any atom was destroyed in the process. They just moved on to a different experience from the human one. On the cell's perspective, it's a doubly tragic genocide. Well, not genocide, but I mean, let's say genocide would be human terms. So, doubly tragic catastrophe and disaster. And of course, the suffering here is unbelievable. If you look at the number of individual cells that had to die in the process, it's unfathomable. It's billions of trillions of cells. When you look at it from the human perspective, then you have plenty of different ways of looking at it. You have the very simple way of just saying that Hitler and the Nazis were evil. You have the human perspective of those that are of the extreme right ideology and would say that it was good. You have those that have a nuanced view and sort of understand that Hitler was but a man, and see, within his own personal experience in life, all of the triggers and experiences that led him to become who he became eventually. Like, for instance, the fact that he fought World War One in Germany, the fact that Germany was then humiliated after World War One, the fact that he was an artist and painter that was frustrated because he wasn't admitted to an artistic school, and all of these things, like one after the other. And you can see that the sum total of all those experiences kind of almost naturally led him to become the dictator, ruthless dictator that he became. And of course, nuance doesn't mean that he's excused, but what you take away from it as a human then is not just hating Hitler, but understanding that under similar circumstances, other people, just about anyone, could also be Hitler. And therefore, what you really hate, quote unquote, or what you really weren't trying to change, is all these parameters. And so you're trying to make sure that no people are humiliated, that people don't feel like they're rejected when they want to pursue a certain career, that war is a traumatic experience, and therefore making sure that all soldiers have access to quality post-traumatic disorder, or whatever, and that they're to get rid of war altogether is something that would prevent another Hitler from emerging. And of course, then you have plenty of other nuances, because from the human perspective, um, you can still view this. There isn't this always this black and white kind of thing. Like some people would say, yeah, Hitler was bad, but then look at what he did for the economy, for instance, the German economy, which was in the dumps in the 1930s. And within a few couple of years, I mean, Hitler managed to make sure that all Germans had, I mean, most Germans had jobs and that the economy kind of recovered. So they would say, as an economic leader, he was great, but then as a war leader, he was terrible. And vice versa. Some people would say, oh, as a war leader, he was perfect, but as an economy leader, I mean, he just implemented basically communism or state capitalism, where he took control, where the state took control of the entire economy and killed the free market. So he's a terrible. And so, I mean, there's just an infinite, almost an infinite number of perspectives here on Hitler that you can have with all kinds of nuances. And then there's the multi-dimensional perspective. And this one, of course, is pure speculation because I have no idea how everything could have unraveled or did unravel. But just for the sake of the thought experiment, let's try to sort of imagine a multidimensional, sort of perspective on the topic of Hitler. So here's what I would say. Imagine you are sort of an archangel, very powerful being, and you're looking down at multidimensional Earth, and you're seeing that it's hurtling towards a timeline where you have communism vs capitalism, and instead of a Cold War, you would have a hot war. That is, no World War II. Germany most likely would have swayed towards communism because, for those of you that know a bit of history, you should know that the biggest party in Germany before Hitler rose to power was the Communist Party. Most of Europe would have probably been drawn towards communism. You'd have revolutions in several countries. And somewhere down in the 1960s, both of these camps would acquire the nuclear technology, nuclear weapons, and would start a nuclear war, which would completely annihilate most of humanity. And so you're a multidimensional being, and you see that, and you're like, oh wow, what can I do to derail that fate, to make sure that humanity escapes that terrible fate? And you look, and then you see this one guy, unsuspecting guy with a little mustache. I'm such a good drawer. And you see that there's just a few buttons that you need to push for this story to sort of derail, making sure that Germany becomes Nazi Germany, because all the Germans are kind of also teetering on the border of revolution, maybe more on the communist side, but still a revolution because of how much their life is difficult after the 1930s and the collapse of their currency, the collapse of their economy. And you see that if that happens, then communism and capitalism will have an alliance together to fight against a common enemy. And that will make sure that you'll have a Cold War, which lowers the likelihood of humanity exterminating itself in a nuclear winter by 99%. And of course, you see that you'll have millions and millions and millions of deaths in the balance, but not billions. And so then, you have to ask yourself, the soul that incarnated to play the role of Hitler, might actually be a soul that is extremely sort of powerful or high up. It might be like an archangel or Jesus or Buddha or whatever, but some kind of soul that is so strong that even once Hitler sort of dies, the body dies, then the consciousness will not become trapped, or the soul will not become trapped in this lower state of vibrations that it became, that it sort of took when it incarnated and when it did all these things that were so vile from the human perspective. And so sometimes the worst characters, the worst people on earth, are just on a multidimensional, on a much higher level, are actually very powerful, very saint figures and souls that are doing this service to humanity because it's the only way for humanity to sort of evolve because of how low their collective level of consciousness is. That is, in the 1930s, the level of consciousness of humanity as a whole was so low that only a Hitler could sort of shake them out of their, collective, this collective path they were taking. Everybody was so materialist. The spirituality was almost nowhere. And so it couldn't have been a savior, quote unquote, type soul like Jesus, or somebody that would start to preach to humanity. Even though there were some of these in the 1930s, and there always are some gurus and some saints that are preaching to humanity, but none of them would have had an impact that is as important as Hitler, for instance, in terms of um, waking up humanity towards looking like just staring directly at the most horrible things that they could have imagined, for humanity to collectively really wish for after this episode peace. Peace above ideology, above, the fact of being right or the fact of supporting an economic or political system. But they wanted peace for at least a couple of decades, more than to support one or the other ideology. And so sometimes it's, unfortunately, when you have a collective consciousness like that of humanity at the time, which yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, when you have such a low level of consciousness, then sometimes you just need people to learn by looking at the worst scenario, making them look at the worst of what humanity can do in order for them to want to do better. And it might be sad to think that that's the only option, but indeed, from this multidimensional perspective, maybe that was the case. And of course, there's no way to prove this. This is just all just speculation. But what's interesting in this exercise from this non duality perspective is that from the multidimensional perspective, Hitler is then a kind of a savior for humanity. And so, what's very interesting is to be able to see all of these perspectives, be conscious of all of these perspectives at once, and hold them inside your head or your heart, and understand that all of them are valid, all of them are true. Hitler is at the same time evil and the worst person. He is at the same time responsible for mass disaster, catastrophe, and death. And at the same time, he's the savior of humanity. And at the same time, he's nothing at all because it was just, some atoms having an adventure that is neither good nor bad, but beyond any kind of judgment or duality. And to be able to see all of these perspectives is part of this non-dual, having a non-dual mind. Um, for me, the start of thinking in a non-dual sense is first to be aware of all the dualities, all of these, all of the human perspectives, seeing that all human perspectives are quote unquote valid. And here I would say that it is the same as asking the perspective of the cells of the nail, the cells of the skin, the blood cells that are going to rush here, the white cells that are going to heal the finger, the stem cells, the cells of the hand that was holding the hammer at the time that the incident happened. And all of these perspectives, if the cells were kind of behaving like humans, would be valid in itself because they would have a unique perspective on what happened here, on the event. Only a human looking at this from his vantage point has a global perspective on both. He understands at the same time that his right hand was kind of clumsy and his left hand was in the way, and all of the other processes that are happening to heal the finger. So the human has the global perspective, which is almost like the sum of all the individual points of view of all of the different cells that were kind of affected by this event of the hammer hitting on the nail. And the same for this example here. Every human has a unique perspective on what happened. All of them are valid in a certain way. And then all of these are also only the multidimensional then perspective can see all of these and make sense of them. And so that's the start for non-dual thinking, is to make sure that all of these perspectives can coexist within your mind or within your heart without them clashing, without the need for you to give one of these perspectives to identify one of these perspectives as true and all the other ones as false. Like, for instance, the perspective of evil as being true and all the other ones as being false, and vice versa, the perspective of Hitler being good and all the other ones being false. Because that's how most people that are still stuck in the dual mindset think. For those that believe that Hitler was good, they believe that this is the true way of looking at Hitler, and all of the other ones are false. That Hitler wasn't evil. He was actually some kind of savior in the sense that if his Nazi ideology was to succeed, then we'd get rid of all of these cockroaches or whatever, or subhuman species that were not worthy of being, or not as good as the Aryan race. So that is still being stuck in the dual thinking. Non-dual thinking is being aware of all of these perspectives and making sure that you understand that all of them are correct. And then beyond duality, going beyond this, is to be able to sense which perspective is sort of resonates, or is how should I say, is temporarily true for a specific purpose. Like, for instance, in this example of the hammer, one temporary lesson that you should learn from it is stay away from hammers until you're old enough to be able to handle one. And then when you're a little older, when you're like 10, for instance, 10 years old, then the other temporary truth is be careful with hammers and learn how to use them. And then there's another temporary truth at 15 when you're even more evolved. And so you understand that the way that you look at the same event can change depending on how the human collective sort of advances in its own consciousness and its own sort of evolution. And so, for instance, at one point in the story of humanity, it was important for everyone to agree that Hitler was evil, because at that point, humanity needed this perspective in order to set its course on this idea of wanting peace and not going into war between communism and capitalism and having a Cold War instead of a hot war. That was necessary at the time. And then as we've grown in maturity, now we can start looking at Hitler in a nuanced way, which is just reflective of how much our consciousness has evolved. And now we can accept that things are much more complex and deal with more complexity than just settling on the fact that he was evil and wishing world peace. A very simplistic way of reasoning. The same is true, about, for instance, the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not kill." And then, as humanity matures, then we sort of find exceptions, and we go much more into detail. Okay, but what if, you kill someone in self-defense, and what if this, what if that? Um, but that's because we've sort of integrated the core principle, and then you can build on that as your consciousness evolves. And so beyond duality is when you still you still sort of settle for one of these perspectives, but you do it um, using a logic that is beyond duality. That is, it's almost like you're letting a higher part of yourself decide what you should think about a certain event, depending on where that will lead you. Because, of course, what you think about anything is like a GPS, For instance, it's responsible for determining how you're going to act in the future. And so if you think that evil was good, for instance, how are you going to act in the future? Well, for instance, you're going to go to Nazi rallies, you're going to, I don't know, become a skinhead, you're going to vote in a certain way. So understand that the way that you view any event will then influence how you're going to act in real life, or react, or take any decisions. And so being stuck in just recognizing everything as being true is like a GPS that would point you in all directions at the same time. That's not workable for a human being. You need to know if you should go right or you should go left. But a GPS which is stuck on just one direction, that's saying turn left, turn left, turn left, turn left, then you're going in circles. You're always going, you're never going to get anywhere either. And being able to sense when you should move from one point of view to another, depending on a destination, which is, the infinite evolution of your consciousness, and which is beyond your control, is the true non-duality. It is like the living cell that is in charge of healing your finger. These cells that are in charge of healing the finger, they have to evolve what they're doing. They have to, upgrade what they're doing, for instance, depending on how the finger is healed. And so it's a sort of evolution. It's not a static. You will never be. How should I say? You'll never be able to settle on only one point of view. Sometimes you'll leverage the multi-dimensional, and then you'll go back to the nuanced. Sometimes you'll just go and say that it's just evil, and that depends on who you're speaking with, the situation. But to be able to jump from one to the other, the logic that determines which level you should be looking at the event is something that comes from the multidimensionality. So, and this is really tough to explain, but again, only a being that can see all of the different timelines that exist from your vantage point, from your now moment, would be able to say that now you should think of Hitler as being evil, because depending on who you're interacting with, like a certain person here, that exchange of information and views is going to set this person on a path which is beneficial from the point of view that you will never be able to understand. And then the next person that comes along, you should have the nuanced point of view. Because for this person, maybe in his multidimensionality and all the different timelines, that exchange of views and information will set him on a different path, which was something that was beneficial for him. And that's what's really hard to understand, is that there is no real set sort of optimal way of thinking about anything or judging anything. It's really all tailored. And then again, it's just about being also self-aware and self-conscious of what you're capable of doing. For instance, you can just signal to the universe, look, I cannot move beyond the nuanced point of view on Hitler. Please make me interact only with people that might find this point of view beneficial. And then you'll attract people that are looking for that point of view specifically. Or you can say that you've evolved a bit and you're even more in the non-dual, beyond non-duality. And you understand that you can jump from one to the other with no problem and say white to a certain person and black to the other, or evil and good, because you understand that ultimately you don't really care, and you don't really care for being sort of coherent. We call coherent. Um, you understand that that's not the point. You understand that there is something larger here at play. Then that's also a sort of a stance that you can take, and you have to signal to the universe, look, I'm ready to jump from one to the other, because I know that ultimately it's just an exchange of information with these other people that I interact with, and that I can say that Hitler was evil to one and good to the other, and that was the right thing to say at the time. And I don't mind if then they accuse me of being contradictory, because I understand that from a multidimensional point of view, contradiction is non-existent. That's not there's no such thing as contradiction. Um, so all of this is very complex in a way, but I think you get the gist of when I'm saying practical non-duality. With these two examples, I think it sort of speaks more to the people of to sort of everyone to understand non-duality a bit better. Um, I mean, at least that's my point of view, of course, because some people in the non-duality teaching, um, I would call them almost like the atomic point of view, where that's where you sort of stay stuck, and then everything is there's only non-judgment. There's only non-judgment, and it's not that it's bad; it's that it is ignoring all of the other perspectives, and I mean, to me, it's more some kind of a denial of judgment, a fleeing away from judgment. And without judgment, though, understand that the GPS here, I said that when you're when you're looking at all of these perspectives, the GPS points everywhere. When you look at only one perspective, like evil, for instance, or good, then the GPS points in the same direction consistently. In terms of what you should be doing, like orienting your determining your actions. And but when you pick the atom perspective, for instance, then it's a GPS that points you nowhere, because ultimately there is no better or worse course of action. Everything is just what it is. Everything is just happening. Everything is just unfolding. Um, and that's also quite dangerous. Like an atom wouldn't have an opinion about a preference if it preferred to be burned in a stove, or if it or enjoying a nice coffee. I mean, for it, it's just a matter of updating it, the information and the energy and whatnot. So I guess, yeah. So that's not non-duality according to me, of course. But some people would say that would liken non-duality to non-judgment, and going beyond good and evil, and that everything is neither good nor evil. I would prefer the one where it is evil and good, the and logic, instead of neither. Um, ultimately both lead to the same kind of conclusion, because when everything has meaning, it's the same as when nothing has meaning, of course. But going towards the additive one, where you sort of look at all of these in turn and then sum them up together, I find is well, yeah, it's just a path that I prefer, because you just get to consciously learn a lot more. Um, what you could also do, again, and some maybe some people in non-duality have reached that level, is if you go directly to the neither point of view and you even discard the atom preference, then you're also sort of delegating judgment as to what is better or worse, towards a multidimensional level. But you're doing it without gaining the the mental sort of knowing of, or doing it consciously. At least that's what I believe. Like, basically, it's almost like you're delegating all of your choices to a higher level without first going through the experience of making all of the different choices and looking at all of the different perspectives, so that you can, when you're actually being given a direction or a intuition to act in a certain way, you would know where it comes from. You would know if it comes from the multidimensional level, and which multidimensional level. And then, I mean, you don't have the structure to sort of look at it like this, because you've directly skipped the part where all of this, you understand that all of these are just um, different perspectives, and that there are an infinite number of ones, and you just say, okay, fine, then let's just go to the nothingness. um, and again, maybe that's one solution for some people. It's not mine, because I need to understand first. And so I hope this was clear and interesting. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and talk to you in the next video.